In the summer of 1967, the Bristol police took the fingerprints of 19,000 men. They were looking for the killer of a 75-year-old widow named Louisa Dunne, who had been strangled and sexually assaulted in her home on Britannia Road in the Easton district of Bristol in the last week of June. They knocked on doors. They asked for men between the approximate ages of 20 and 50. They asked each of those men to press his fingers to an ink pad and then to a card. They collected, over the course of the summer and into the autumn, 1,300 witness statements and more than 8,000 individual household visits. None of the 19,000 fingerprints matched. The killer, in the summer of 1967, was not among the men the Bristol police thought to canvass. He lived in Bristol. He was 34 years old. He was an immigrant from the West Indies who had arrived in the United Kingdom in 1952. He was, at the time of the canvassing, outside the geographic boundaries that the investigation had drawn on its map. He remained free and unquestioned for the next 58 years. On July 1, 2025, at the age of 92, he was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Louisa Dunne. He is, by the public record of British criminal law, the oldest defendant ever convicted of a murder in the history of the United Kingdom. His name is Ryland Headley. This is his case, and the case of the widow he killed in 1967, and the case of a pale blue skirt that had been preserved in a Bristol evidence cabinet for 56 years before a modern DNA laboratory pulled from it in 2023 the profile that finally named him. Louisa Dunne was 75 years old. She lived alone in a small terraced house on Britannia Road in a working-class neighborhood on the eastern side of Bristol. Her husband had died some years earlier. She had been, by the accounts of her surviving grandchildren, a quietly sociable woman, the kind of older person who kept in regular touch with her children and her grandchildren, who attended her local church, who exchanged small gifts with her neighbors on the street. She had family elsewhere in Bristol and in the surrounding area. She had a granddaughter named Mary Dainton, who was in her teens in 1967, and who would, in the decades that followed, become the family member who carried her grandmother's memory through the long, cold case. In the last week of June 1967, on a date that was either the 26th or the 27th, the precise evening was never fully established, Ryland Headley entered the back of Louisa Dunne's house through a window. He strangled her. He sexually assaulted her. He left. Neighbors, later canvassed, reported that they had heard a scream. Some of them had heard it clearly. Others had heard a sound they had not, at the time, been able to classify. None of them, hearing the scream, had called the police. On the morning of June 28, 1967, a neighbor who had been expecting to see Louisa at a regular meeting called on the house. The door was closed. The curtains were drawn. The neighbor went around the back. She found Louisa's body in the sitting room. The Bristol Constabulary, which would, in later years, become the Avon and Somerset Police, arrived at the scene within the hour. The investigation that began that afternoon would become, over the course of the next 2 years, one of the largest single-victim murder investigations conducted in Bristol in the post-war era. The investigators took forensic evidence. They took photographs of the scene. They recovered from the back window a palm print that had been left by the person who had climbed in. They recovered clothing from Louisa's body that had been transferred with the assailant's bodily fluids. They stored, among the physical evidence from the scene, a pale blue skirt that Louisa had been wearing at the time of her death. The skirt was catalogued. It was placed in an evidence cabinet. It was, across the following 5 decades, preserved in the Bristol Evidence Storage Facility. It was not, during any of those decades, subjected to DNA analysis. because DNA analysis did not exist during any of those decades. The conventional investigative techniques of 1967 produced, as their primary product, the massive fingerprint canvas. 19,000 men gave their fingerprints voluntarily. Another 1,300 gave statements. 8,000 households were visited. The file on the Dunne case at the end of the 1967 investigation contained more than enough paperwork to fill 20 large cardboard boxes. None of the paperwork named Ryland Headley. He was at the time living in Bristol. He was employed as a laborer. He had, by the demographic and geographic assumptions the Bristol police had used to draw the boundaries of their canvass, fallen outside the catchment area. The canvass had concentrated on men living within a relatively narrow radius of the victim's home. Headley, who lived further out, had not been approached. He was also, at that point, a man without a criminal record. His record would come into being in the following decade. In 1977 and 1978, Ryland Headley committed 2 sexual assaults on elderly women in the town of Ipswich, approximately 200 miles east of Bristol. Both of the victims were in their late 70s or 80s. Both had been alone in their homes when Headley had entered. Both had been attacked in a manner that would, decades later, be recognized by Bristol investigators as consistent with the method used against Louisa Dunne in 1967. He was convicted in 1978 of both Ipswich assaults. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The sentence was subsequently reduced on appeal to 7 years.
He served the reduced sentence. He was released. He returned to ordinary life, to employment, to housing, to the continuation of an existence that, for the next several decades, was publicly unremarkable. In 2012, some 35 years after the Ipswich assaults, Ryland Headley's DNA was entered into the United Kingdom's National DNA Database following an unrelated incident. The entry was a routine one. It reflected a minor matter, unconnected to either the Dunne case or the Ipswich assaults. What mattered, for the long history of the Dunne investigation, was simply that the profile was now in the system. It sat in the database for 11 years. In 2023, the Avon and Somerset Police's Major Crime Review Team, a small unit whose work consisted of systematic reinvestigation of the force's most significant unsolved cases, opened the Dunne file for its periodic review. The detective leading the review was a man named Marchant. He and his team pulled, from the evidence storage facility, the 20 boxes of materials that had been preserved from the 1967 investigation. They cataloged each item. They identified the items that had not been subjected to the forensic techniques that had come into existence in the decades since the original work. Among those items was the pale blue skirt. The skirt was sent to a forensic laboratory for modern DNA extraction. The analysis was conducted over a period of several months. In May of 2024, the laboratory returned its report. It had recovered, from the skirt, a complete male DNA profile. The profile was, by the laboratory's calculation, 1 billion times more likely to have originated from Ryland Headley than from any unrelated individual. The match had come, at last, through the National DNA Database entry that Headley had made in 2012 on his unrelated matter. A palm print from the back window of the house in 1967 was, at the same time, re-examined by 4 independent fingerprint experts. All 4 of them concluded that the palm print was consistent with the palm of Ryland Headley's hand. The Avon and Somerset Police arrested Ryland Headley in November of 2024 at his home in Ipswich, where he had been living for many years. He was 92 years old. He made his first appearance before a Bristol court on November 20th, 2024, via video link from a secure facility. He did not contest the arrest. He did not make any public statement about the charges. His trial began in the spring of 2025 at the Bristol Crown Court. The trial presented the prosecution with a specific and unusual procedural challenge. The original 1967 witnesses, the neighbors who had heard the scream, the people who had seen strangers on Britannia Road in the hours before and after the killing, were, by 2025, nearly all deceased. Only one of them remained alive. The Crown Prosecution Service applied to the court for permission to introduce the 1967 statements of the deceased witnesses as hearsay evidence, written testimony from people who could no longer be called to the witness stand. The application was granted. It was, by the analysis of legal commentators at the time, one of the first instances in British criminal law in which an ancient written statement had been admitted in a modern murder trial through the hearsay exception on this scale. The 1967 witnesses, most of them speaking in the trial record, through yellowed paper bearing the signatures of police officers who had also, by 2025, long since died, described what they had seen and heard on the street where Louisa Dunne had lived. Their voices, preserved in the handwriting of the investigators who had taken their statements, were read aloud in a 2025 courtroom to a jury that had been born decades after all of them had gone. The prosecution also introduced, under the doctrine of bad character evidence, Headley's 1977 and 1978 Ipswich convictions. The court accepted that the method of those assaults, entry into the homes of elderly women living alone, sexual assault during the encounter, was sufficiently similar to the method used against Louisa Dunne in 1967 to be probative of Headley's propensity. The defense contested the inclusion of the Ipswich evidence. The court's ruling stood. The trial ran its course across several weeks in June of 2025. On June 30th, 2025, the jury returned its verdict. They convicted Ryland Headley of the rape of Louisa Dunne unanimously. They convicted him of her murder by a vote of 10-2. On July 1st, 2025, Justice Derek Sweeting delivered the sentence. He sentenced Headley to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years. He spoke directly to the defendant during the sentencing. His words, reported in the national British press and quoted in the subsequent legal commentary, were as specific as the court record allowed. "You violated her home," he said, "her body, and, as a result, her life. It was a cruel and brutal act." He continued, in a sentence that would appear in the headlines of the following morning's coverage, to address the practical meaning of the sentence. "You will die in prison," he said. Headley, at 92, would need to live to 112 to complete the minimum term. The arithmetic of the sentence was, in the context of human lifespan, decisive. He was taken from the courtroom. He remains, as of the writing of this, in a British correctional facility, serving the life sentence that was imposed on July 1st, 2025. He is, by the public record maintained by the British press, the oldest person ever convicted of a murder in the history of the United Kingdom. He is, by the particular arithmetic of his age and his sentence, also the oldest person to be given a sentence that was, from the moment of its imposition, functionally, a sentence to die in custody. Mary Dainton, Louisa Dunne's granddaughter, spoke to reporters in the aftermath of the conviction. She had, she said, reconciled herself across the decades to the possibility that some murders are never solved. The killing of her grandmother had happened, she added, on the day of her own birthday, a coincidence that had, for her, permanently joined two otherwise unrelated dates in her personal calendar. "I'm used to the idea," she said, "that some deaths do not get resolved. I am not sure I have yet adjusted to the idea
that this one has. She did not, in her public statements, express anger toward Headley. She expressed, rather, a quiet relief that the question her family had carried since the summer of 1967 had been, by the verdict of a Bristol jury, closed. Louisa Dunne, she said, had not deserved what had happened to her. No one in the family had ever believed that she had. What the family had not been able to know, across the 58 years of the cold case, was who had done it. They knew now. The man who had killed her had lived, across the decades of the unsolved case, within a short journey of her grave. He had been in Bristol. He had been in Ipswich. He had been in correctional facilities and in ordinary residences. He had been, in the public record of his own later convictions, a man whom the British justice system already knew about, but not in connection with Louisa Dunne, until the DNA from the pale blue skirt had been matched. The palm print on the back window had also been there the entire time. The palm print had, like the skirt, been preserved in the 1967 evidence boxes. It had waited across the decades for the comparison techniques that would, in 2024 and 2025, produce the match. 4 independent fingerprint experts looked at it. All 4 of them said it was Ryland Headley's hand. The case of Louisa Dunne is, as of the writing of this, closed. The case of the witnesses who testified in 1967, whose voices, from yellowed paper, spoke across decades into a Bristol courtroom in 2025, is, in its way, one of the quietly significant procedural chapters of modern British legal history. Future prosecutions of cold case murders in the United Kingdom will, based on the precedent established in the Dunne trial, be able to introduce the voices of witnesses who have, in the natural course of the intervening decades, died before the case was finally brought. Those voices will, like the 1967 witnesses in the Dunne case, be read from the paper on which they were first recorded. The investigators who took the statements, the Bristol constables who knocked on doors in the summer of 1967, who listened to neighbors describe what they had heard through the wall that night, who wrote down what those neighbors said, are also, in nearly all cases, dead. Their handwriting remains. What remains in the evidence rooms of the Avon and Somerset police after the Dunne conviction is the pale blue skirt that Louisa Dunne wore on the last evening of her life, the palm print from the back window of her house, the 20 boxes of files from the 1967 investigation, and the several generations of police officers whose careers had touched the case without being able, for the technological limitations of their eras, to close it. The officer who closed it, Detective Marchant, was one in a long chain. The man who had killed Louisa Dunne is in a British prison cell. He is 92 years old. He has been told by the judge who sentenced him that he will die there. The verdict of the Bristol jury made it so. The palm print, after 58 years, made it so. The pale blue skirt, after 56 years in an evidence cabinet, made it so. Louisa Dunne, whose voice the court never heard, has, at last, been answered.